What's going on, everyone? Let's talk about Russia's withdrawal from Kherson. Got an article here. Some parts I agree with, others not so much, but I thought it'd be good to kind of spark the conversation. It's titled Surovikin's Difficult Choice. Russia Abandons Kherson by Big Surge on Substack, and I'll put a link to the article in the description below so you can check it out if interested. Diving right in, he lists out four possibilities. He says, number one, the Ukrainian army has defeated the Russian army on the West Bank and driven it back across the river. Number two, Russia is setting a trap in Kherson. Number three, a secret peace agreement has been negotiated, which includes giving Kherson back to Ukraine. And number four, Russia has made a politically embarrassing but militarily prudent operational choice. Most of the article is going to be focused on the first and fourth bullets there. Possibility one, military defeat. The recapture of Kherson is being fairly celebrated by Ukrainians as a victory. The question is just what kind of victory is it? Political, optical, or military? I think you're going to see in this article a couple times, maybe I'm being overly sensitive. I think they're kind of parsing words to make this look in a way that it isn't in reality. From my point of view, my opinion, what happened in Kherson is a political and military victory for Ukraine. This is territory that was a part of Ukraine. Russia came in and took by force, and now Ukraine has retaken. I think it's hard to phrase that as anything but a Ukrainian victory, no matter how it played out or the reasons that it played out. He continues on, first off, as recently as the morning of November 9th, hours before the withdrawal was announced, some Russian war correspondents were expressing skepticism about the withdrawal rumors because Russia's forward defensive lines were completely intact. Not crazy. That's how a withdrawal turns into a rout. You have to keep the defensive positions manned until the last minute, have some sort of rear guard in place so that the Ukrainian forces don't charge in and kill, destroy all the Russian equipment as they're trying to evacuate. So the fact that those lines were intact checks out, makes sense. He says, secondly, Ukraine was not executing any intense offensive efforts in the region at the time the withdrawal began. Even with Russia withdrawing, they were clearly scared to advance because their last few attempts to push through the defenses in the area became mass casualty events. This first bullet point here, I feel like he's making an argument, is arguing against a point that I haven't really heard made. The idea that I haven't heard anybody argue that Ukraine was at gunpoint pushing Russian forces out of Kherson. That didn't happen. But one of the main reasons that Russia did have to leave Kherson, and we'll get to that even in this article, has to do with the pressure that Ukraine has enacted on the Russian forces there and their supply chain and their logistics to keep it reinforced over the last few months. So again, it's kind of created an argument that isn't there, but some points worth getting into. He continues saying, overall, Russia's withdrawal was implemented very quickly with minimal pressure from the Ukrainians. At the exact time of the withdrawal, yes, I think that's missing a lot of the events leading up to the withdrawal, like the long-range precision strikes on logistics and supply hubs, keeping the troops in Kherson in the fight. He wraps up by saying Russia simply slipped back across the river without pursuit by the Ukrainians, taking negligible losses and getting virtually all of their equipment out. So far, a broken-down T-90 is the only Ukrainian capture of note. Right when this started, there were a lot of rumors about 20 to 30,000 Russian forces being captured. That doesn't appear to have played out. I think it was just rumor. So from everything I've seen, that portion of taking negligible losses does seem to be accurate. It looks like Russia executed this withdrawal well in terms of not suffering manpower losses. Definitely been a little more equipment than one tank captured. Again, I'm not on the battlefield, so going off pictures and videos and interviews that I've seen, but there's definitely been more equipment captured than one piece. Hard to say right now, November 14th, if it's more than what was captured in and around Izium. It doesn't look like it. But to say one tank was captured, I think is downplaying that a little bit. Finally, he says the net score on the Kherson front remains a strong casualty imbalance in favor of Russia, and they once again withdraw without suffering a battlefield defeat and with their forces intact. So, the casualty imbalance in favor of Russia, that's entirely possible down in Kherson. The casualty figures have been so hard to parse out in this war at baseline. But it is an area that Ukraine attempted a counterattack over the last few months, and it saw some success. They retook some territory, but there were also a lot of reports of pretty substantial losses, which wouldn't be crazy. Russia had really built up some pretty serious defensive positions in the area, and everybody was talking about a Kherson counterattack, right? It wasn't a surprise. People saw it coming. They saw the buildup. So if the casualty imbalance is, skews in favor of Russia, that's not crazy. The concept of withdrawing without suffering a battle defeat and without their forces intact, I think that's negligible. Take that out. That's the United States experience in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not a victory then, right? You can't pin this one little thing as proof that the overall war is going to be won because you haven't suffered a battlefield victory. They left the territory. Ukraine took it back. So I think the concept of looking at casualty figures and battlefield victories or not being pushed off the battlefield, I think might paint a false picture of the conflict, just because historically that hasn't always been the best thing to point to. Possibility 2, it's a trap. There are 2 possible interpretations of this. 1, a conventional battlefield maneuver involving a timely counterattack, and 2, some sort of unconventional move like a tactical nuclear weapon. I agree with the author on just about every part here. He says it's clear there's no battlefield counter in the offing for the simple reason that Russia blew the bridges behind them. With no Russian forces left on the West Bank and the bridges wrecked, there is no immediate capacity for either army to attack the other in force. Agree, it doesn't look like there's some pincer movement getting ready to strike down on the Ukrainians as soon as they move into Kherson. Between the Ukrainians and the Russians striking these bridges over the last few months, it's not a swift counterattack does not appear to be in the offing. He adds, if Russia wanted to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, there's no sensible reason why they would choose a regional capital that they annexed as the site to do it. Russia has no shortage of delivery systems. If they wanted to nuke Ukraine, very simply, they wouldn't bother abandoning their own city and making that the blast site. They would simply nuke Ukraine. I agree. I don't think that this makes the case any more or any less for a nuclear weapon to be used. There is a 1,000+ kilometer front and plenty of targets if Russia wanted to use that option. Possibility 3, a secret deal. This was sparked by the news that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been in contact with his Russian counterpart, and specifically the sense that the White House has been pushing for negotiations. Under one rumored variant of the, quote, Sullivan deal, Ukraine would acknowledge Russia's annexations east of the Dnieper, while the West Bank Kherson would revert back to Kyiv's control. So essentially, under this hypothetical rumored deal, haven't seen anything concrete about it, the dividing line of what would go to Russia and what would go to Ukraine is the Dnieper River that Russia just passed across to reinforce their lines on the east side. That by itself, I think, could make sense. From a negotiating stance, I think if you're going to sit down at the negotiating table right now, let's say, Ukraine would say, well, we already own all this territory, Russia. You're not giving, you're just taking. Seems like it would make more sense for Russia to hold that territory until the negotiations start, and then as a gesture of goodwill say, fine, I guess we'll withdraw across the river and you can have this side of it. So it's a little bit off. Not sold on this part, and this is the other argument here that I'm just not all in on. He says, ultimately, the main reason to doubt the news of a secret deal is the fact that the war is continuing on all the other fronts. I don't think that makes the case for or against negotiations. I just wrapped up All Quiet on the Western Front, the Netflix one that just came out a couple weeks ago. And it's just a sad reminder that even in the midst of a massive war, people dying every minute of every day, negotiations can be ongoing with the fighting still raging intensely all across the front. So the fact that there's fighting all across the Donbass and other parts of Ukraine, that doesn't mean that there is or isn't a peace deal in the works. But again, personal opinion there. Getting into possibility 4, and there's a fair amount on this chunk that I agree with the author. And really all we're doing at this point is explaining the withdrawal. So the first few are kind of like some theories that don't really have any theories and rumors and things that I haven't really seen out there. Now we're getting into kind of an explanation of why the withdrawal was needed. Possibility 4, a difficult operational choice. This withdrawal was subtly signaled shortly after General Surovikin was put in charge of the operation in Ukraine. In his first press conference, he signaled dissatisfaction with the Kherson front, calling the situation tense and difficult. That is accurate. He did do that. They said Kherson was becoming an inefficient front for Russia because of the logistical strain of supplying forces across the river with limited bridge and road capacity. Russia demonstrated that it was capable of shouldering this sustainment burden, but the question becomes, to what purpose and for how long? Ideally, the bridgehead becomes the launching point for offensive action against Nikolaev, but launching an offensive would require strengthening the force grouping in Kherson, which correspondingly raises the logistical burden of projecting forces across the river. With a very long front to play with, all across eastern Ukraine, Kherson is clearly one of the most logistically intensive axes. My guess, and this is the author speaking, is that Surovikin took charge and almost immediately decided he did not want to increase the sustainment burden by trying to push on Nikolaev. That passes the common sense test. Added to this next part here, while holding the bridgehead in Kherson, the Dnieper River becomes a negative force multiplier, increasing the sustainment and logistics burden and ever threatening to leave forces cut off if Ukraine succeeds in destroying the bridges or bursting the dam. Projecting force across the river becomes a heavy burden with no obvious benefit. We're talking about projecting directly onto the other bank like they have been now for a few months. But by withdrawing to the east bank, the river becomes a positive force multiplier by serving as a defensive barrier. The Kherson bridgehead is, unless an offensive towards Nikolaev is planned, the Kherson bridgehead is militarily counterproductive. I agree with most of this. I think it's a solid analysis as to why this is not a suitable position for Russia to continue holding. And I think more than anything that the author's gotten into so far, this is the reason why Russia withdrew. And it's not like a big surprise or something that's just people are grasping right now. For months now, there's been conversation that this is becoming too much for Russia to hold on to, and for what? Unless they're going to try a breakout from Kherson, and that didn't appear to be in the works, which leads to the final part here that might speak to future plans for Russia. The author says, in the broader operational sense, Surovikin seems to be declining battle in the south while preparing in the north and in the Donbass. Withdrawing across the river increases the combat effectiveness of the army significantly and decreases the logistical burden, freeing resources for other sectors. That's fair. Almost his whole fourth point here I agree with. It was becoming too much to sustain. Those forces were requiring a lot of effort to keep them supplied and in the fight, and I think you can say that they were. They repelled Ukrainian counteroffensives over the last couple months, so they had enough manpower, equipment, and supplies to at least do that, but it comes at a cost. And it sounds like the most reasonable explanation that I've come across so far, that cost was too high for what they were gaining in Kherson. It makes sense to pull those troops out and the equipment out and potentially use that manpower elsewhere. Whether that ends up being a new offensive in the Donbass before the new year, or maybe they get teamed up as the conscripts are coming in, the 300,000 conscripts are coming into the force over the next few months. We'll see. But anyways, I thought that was interesting. A couple points that really nobody's arguing, but worth talking through. And finally, what I think is probably the most realistic analysis of why Russia withdrew from Kherson. But that'll do it for now. Let me know what you think. We'll see y'all next time.